Well, the green's missing. Maybe I can still pop over to Deacon Hunt's for a flip. The small town of Franklin, Connecticut has a problem. Its town greens went missing and nobody seems to know where they were. If you ask around, you'll likely be told by residents that the town never had any. If you investigate town histories, they either don't mention greens or deny their existence entirely. What if I told you, however, that Franklin did have town greens and that they were important public spaces for the community? The town greens disappeared from our landscape and our memories, but over the course of the last year, I found them. This is the case of the missing town greens. In this video, I will be discussing not only the location of Franklin's town greens, but the wider significance of greens in New England history and the importance of recognizing why and how Franklin's greens were forgotten. During the video, keep an eye out for citation numbers, as these correspond to footnotes in the script linked in the description. To understand Franklin's two greens, we must talk about the town's geography. Franklin is a town with two halves, split roughly down the middle, east and west. The eastern portion of town, which extended to the Chautauqua River until 1861, was born out of the Pautipaug Ecclesiastical Society. The western half was born out of the West Farms Ecclesiastical Society. These so-called societies were some of the building blocks of colonial-era town government. The greens were sited, along with meeting houses, to function as a center for community and town life. It is often believed that a green typically had a full village which surrounded them, filled with houses, taverns, and shops. However, villages like that are a product of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Instead, colonial settlement tended to be spread out, with communities centered around a meeting house with a green. This meeting house and green were placed to be the center of a community, rather than a commercial center, and their location was in many cases decided after people had begun living in a particular area. Roads would then be created to lead to the green and meeting house if they did not already exist, so these roads weren't necessarily major avenues of traffic that would bring economic activity in and out of a community. Often, only tavern keepers needed a location in this period at the community center. It's not until the latter part of the 18th century that this began to change, and commercial villages began to form. These were areas where a more traditional village would grow, centered on trade and manufacturing. These commercial centers did sometimes exist on town greens, but also sometimes did not, and were instead placed or grew in economically advantageous locations. In Franklin, there were two primary commercial villages which formed during the 18th and 19th centuries. Neither became a new town center, in part due to their location on the periphery of town. The first was south of the intersection of modern Routes 32 and 87 near the town line with Norwich. This village was paved over to create Route 32 as we know it, and in doing so erased the earlier road that led from Norwich to Windham. The other commercial village was near Lord's Bridge on the Chautauqua River, and in the 1850s became known as the village of Baltic. Baltic would ultimately be incorporated into the town of Sprague out of Franklin in 1861. For now, all of this is really to say that if you're looking for some kind of complete village to mark where Franklin's greens had been, you're looking in all the wrong places. Franklin's commercial villages grew not on the greens, but on the periphery, where trade and travel was more easily conducted. That's not to say that Franklin's greens lacked any semblance of a commercial village, but they were not the primary economic centers of town. Each half of town had its own green. To verbalize this represents a new chapter in our town's history. It was believed by previous town historians, even when they quoted some of the same evidence that I use, that, quote, "we have found no record of any action ever taken to establish a green." This video is not intended to call out any individual. But it is important to recognize the areas where town history has not been done well, and the town greens are a particularly egregious example. In 2005, the then town historian was contacted by the Quinebaug-Shetucket Heritage Corridor as that organization was working on a publication about local town greens. The historian was not very thorough in his search, and his ultimate logic was faulty. If there had been a movement for a green of our own, there was land on the hill near the church which might have been available for a green, but we have found no record of any action ever taken to establish one. There is one mention of a green in 1786. The selectmen were empowered to erect a, quote, stock on the green near the church, end quote. Nothing else is said about it, whether it was built, or whether it was used, or for that matter, whether any money was voted for its construction. I rather think the matter was never pushed any further. The argument he presented was dissonant and spurious, and relied on the idea that because he hadn't seen any evidence, there could not have been a green. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially as in the case of Franklin's town greens, there is actually a plethora of evidence. You just have to look in the right places. Additionally, the green mentioned in 1786 already existed, so if he was looking in the town hall for evidence from after the year 1786, at least for that green, there wouldn't have been any records of money or construction. This earlier belief that there was never a town green, nor any village associated with one, is a fundamental misunderstanding of how our town and community has developed and changed since the 1600s. As such, to better understand Franklin's history, we have to establish where the greens were. The West Farms Green has been staring us in the face for a long time. Right in front of us, on Meeting House Hill. Its shape resembled that of a bow tie, oriented from the northeast to the southwest. The northeastern triangle was where the meeting house sat until the early 1860s and is hilly. A schoolhouse sat on the smaller, flatter southwestern triangle, while a series of homes surrounded the entire green and created a small village. Together, both triangles contained about 4 acres of land. Today, the shape of the northerly triangle is marked by a stone wall and hedge which runs from the entrance of Dr. Knott Road all the way down to Pound Hill Road. Pound Hill Road intersects with that and completes another side of the green, and this triangle is then closed by Meeting House Hill Road, a constant reminder in the geography of the town of what once was. The southwesterly triangle is not as obvious, as much more of it is now in private hands. Yet, when you drive by, you can still see a private road that once marked the end of the green. This green came about in 2 stages. The larger 2-acre plot in front of me dates to when the meeting house was first established and built between the years 1718 and 1720. In 1720, Joshua Abel formally ceded the land to the West Farms Society.
Is bounded as followeth, beginning at a white oak tree, standing southerly from said meeting house, running easterly abutting southerly on land of Benjamin Peck, 30 rods, from thence running northwesterly by the old path 29 rods and a half, from thence southwesterly abutting on land of Mr. Wills, bought of said Joshua Abel, 18 rods and a half to a stump with stones about it, from thence more southerly abutting on land of Mr. Wills, bought of Ensign Waterman, 14 rods and a half to the white oak first mentioned.
The green was later expanded in 1767 when the Society purchased approximately 3/4 of an acre behind me from Henry and Joshua Wiles to accommodate the public. In other words, this was an expansion of the green to better suit the needs of the townspeople and a growing ecclesiastical society. This purchase formed the southwesterly triangle of the bow tie of the green, and this is the shape that the green had when it was mentioned in the town meeting record in 1786. There are visual sources which support the shape of the green. The clearest is an 1858 distance map of the town, while it also appears on Dr. Ashbel Woodward's map of West Farms. Deeds also help to corroborate this property's use as a town green, with language which typically states that the property was
lying and being in the first society in said Franklin adjoining the meeting house common in said society.
We have visual and written evidence that there was a green right here on Meeting House Hill. By the last quarter of the 18th century, the green had both a meeting house and schoolhouse built on top of it. Furthermore, it was surrounded by private homes, one of which was operated as a tavern. Taken together, a village had taken shape in the center of Franklin. If the West Society had a green, then the Eastern Society must have as well. The question is then, where was the Pautipaug Green? The location of the Pautipaug Green is less obvious from just looking at aerial and satellite imagery, but like the Meeting House Hill Green, it couldn't stay hidden forever. Tucked away in the Town Hall archives is a deed which reads,
Know ye that we, Martha Fox and Elizabeth Fox of Franklin, in the county of New London and state of Connecticut, for and in consideration of the sum of $50, received to our full satisfaction of Stephen Brewster, Phineas Peck, and James Armstrong, all of said Franklin and the county aforesaid, as they are a committee appointed by the East Society in said Franklin, to purchase a piece of land for the purpose of setting a meeting house and a place of parade for the military company in said society, do give, grant, bargain, sell, and confirm unto them, and to the rest of the inhabitants of said society, their heirs and successors, forever for the above said purpose, 100 rods of land, lying in said Franklin, at the corner nearly opposite to the dwelling.
Ultimately, the committee purchased 100 rods of land from the Fox sisters, and a further 44 rods of land from Pelatiah Armstrong. The Pautipaug Green was a little under an acre in size. The land sold by the Fox sisters and Pelatiah Armstrong is here, at the intersection of Route 207 and Pautipaug Hill Road. According to the 1858 distance map, the green shape resembled a slightly misshapen box. The meeting house, finally built by subscription in 1815, was situated on the green, just over there where that house is, and was surrounded by a schoolhouse over there, and a few other homes, and even a blacksmith shop. While not as large of a village as those centered around Lord's Bridge and Hyde's Tavern, this could be described as a small commercial village. We also know that this was viewed as a green. In 1865, Lavius A. Robinson wrote that he went to the Pautipaug Green schoolhouse to attend a lyceum. However, the green mentioned in those deeds is actually the second Pautipaug Green. Pautipaug was officially formed in 1762, but had existed in an unofficial capacity since the late 1740s. At that time, they had built a meeting house on Holton Road just behind me. It sat on approximately half an acre of land owned by Joseph Eyre. We can conclusively say that there were town greens in Franklin, mystery solved, but that begs the question, what was their purpose and what happened to them? Greens were not just a park. Instead, they were functional properties which were used for public purposes, and most prominently for meeting houses and schools. The meeting house served not only as a religious center, but as the center of town government. Puritans and their 18th century descendants conceived of the church not as the physical building, but of the congregation itself. Thus, the meeting house has to be understood not only as a building where religious worship occurred, but as one of the few public buildings in a community. It was even referred to in Franklin's own town records as the public meeting house. Another marker of the public nature of town greens were signposts for news and business. Connecticut statutes mandated that towns maintain signposts near the center of every town, where proclamations sent forth be set up and published, notices of strays, sales of houses and lands, and advertisements of such like occasions shall be set up to be read. You'd see warnings for town meetings, ecclesiastical society meetings, and more posted on these signs. No wonder then that they were placed on or near each green in Franklin. In 1720, the West Farm Society voted to build and maintain its first sign. By the end of the 18th century, there were 2 signposts in the West Society, 2 more in the East, and a 5th located at the Hyde Tavern in the south of town. The greens were locations where people congregated and passed through frequently, which is why these notice boards were located on them. Debt auctions were advertised and sometimes held on the town greens. Central and open, residents could easily gather to bid on any number of goods that were put up for sale by the town to help pay off an individual's debt or back taxes. For instance, real estate which belonged to Samuel Badger Jr., Jabez Downer, John Hartshorn, and Gideon Peck were all put up for auction on June 5, 1787, at the signpost in the First Society. Similarly, Theophilus Tracy had real estate auctioned off on the green in 1788 to help pay his society tax. While these auctions could also occur at the property that was up for sale, it was easier in cases where many properties had to be auctioned off on the same day to be done so from a central public location. Thus, the town greens played an important role in the town's finances. Another use of the greens was for punishing various crimes. Franklin's residents voted to erect stocks on the green in 1786. You may be familiar with their cousin, the pillory, in which an individual's head and hands were restrained in a public place to punish them. Stocks served a similar purpose, but instead constrained an individual's feet. Lawbreakers were placed on display and subject to verbal and sometimes physical abuse from onlookers. The stocks were placed in a central location, the green, for that reason. It meant that the offender's punishment would be public. The Meeting House Hill Green was chosen for the stocks as it was a, quote, most convenient location, further demonstrating the central role that greens played in early Franklin. As Franklin was not a shire town where court was held for the county, the harshest punishments were not doled out on our green. If one was to be sentenced to be branded or executed, that would have occurred here on the Norwich Town Green. The highest level of law available in Franklin and its antecedents were justices of the peace, and while they had authority, their jurisdiction was for more relatively minor cases against the peace, up to the cost of 40 shillings or £2. Think assault, minor thefts, or drunkenness. There is one final institution which also used Franklin's town greens. For white men in Franklin during the 18th and early 19th centuries, militia service was a fact of life, and until 1816 the town had two companies, one based in the west and one in the east. Many changes had occurred on the east side of town, and so the East Society put together a committee to locate and purchase a property to serve as the home of a new meeting house and as a, quote, parade for the military company in said society. That refers to the 6th Company, 20th Militia Regiment. Militia companies were expected to parade twice a year for training, and 6th Company's muster was right here on the Pautipaug Green. Men within company bounds would don their uniforms, consisting of dark blue coats with red lapels and tall collars, and make their way to the green on the appointed day, having been properly alerted by a non-commissioned officer. You can almost hear Captain Cherub Abel shouting commands in the spring of 1799, while fifers and drummers practiced their trade and helped keep the men in step. It was on the Pautipaug Green that the men of 6th Company learned to operate as an effective military unit, which would come in handy during the War of 1812. We can't say for certain where 2nd Company, from the western side of town, met for their militia training, though it was likely right here on the Green. In particular, the geography of the 1767 expansion lent itself to militia training as it was much flatter than the other half. Here, too, you can imagine the scene as men mustered and drilled under the watchful eyes of their officers. As the 19th century marched forward, the militia evolved as an institution. In 1816, Franklin's two companies of militia were combined to form a single, larger company. In 1847, the long-standing compulsory militia was replaced with a volunteer militia, and the nearest company was then based in Norwich. While Franklin men would elect to serve in the militia after this point, Franklin's town greens ceased to be company training grounds. One of the original purposes of the greens had vanished. These are only a smattering of the uses for greens, and even with just a handful of examples, you can see how they were an extremely important part of community life. The question then remains, for something so important, what happened to the greens? How did we, as a town, forget about this part of our history? The greens slowly slipped away. There wasn't a singular moment in which the greens were sold away or noted as leaving, but a culmination of factors led to their irrelevance. As mentioned, in 1847, Connecticut's militia underwent a major reorganization, and the compulsory militia was replaced with an all-volunteer one. Under this new system, Franklin lost its own militia company, and so the greens were no longer needed for the company parade grounds. Even when Thomas G. Kingsley was colonel of the 3rd Militia Regiment in this period, their rendezvous was in Norwich and elsewhere in New London County. The militia no longer trained in Franklin. The 1860s also marked a few other major turning points. Part of Pautipaug was incorporated into Sprague, the East Society was shuttered, the West Society moved its meeting house off of the Green, and a separate town hall was built for government business. What remained on the Greens after this point were schoolhouses and the small villages that surrounded them. After this, the Greens continued to slip away, and 2 other factors sealed their fates. The first was the car. Cars required wider, straighter, and paved roads to operate effectively, and so the roads themselves were often changed to accommodate. Many of the roads in town today follow paths of old roads, but they've been widened and straightened in various places. Both Greens fell victim to this, as Route 207, Meeting House Hill Road, and Pound Hill Road all were transformed with paving. Pautipaug Green has almost been entirely subsumed and swallowed up by the road. In the 1930s, there was a small vestige of the Green left, but by 1964, it had disappeared under pavement. The second factor were the one-room schoolhouses. Franklin used its schoolhouses until 1958 when the elementary school was opened. One-room schoolhouses helped a sliver of the Greens and their earlier public purpose to survive. Looking at aerial photographs, you can see that there was a schoolhouse on both Greens in the 1930s. On Meeting House Hill, it was near the center of the 1767 expansion, and the Pautipaug Schoolhouse was on the north side of its green. Once the schoolhouses were auctioned off, the Greens disappeared for good. While the schoolhouses kept some of the geography of the Greens around, would anyone alive in 1958 have remembered the town Greens? Perhaps, but they would have been in a minority. The heyday of Franklin's Greens had been the 17 and 1800s. By 1900, remnants were left, but these were simply imprints in the sand. The Greens themselves were long gone. Franklin's town Greens played an important role in community life during the 18th and 19th centuries. They were central gathering places where government business was conducted, people attended religious services, lawbreakers were punished, the militia trained, news was spread, and more. These were important spaces to those who lived in Franklin. Yet, for all of their importance, they eventually disappeared. Franklin lost its Greens to time, although there are still some reminders of their existence. It wasn't only the Greens themselves that disappeared, but their memory too. It became easy for Franklin residents to claim without hesitation, we never had town Greens. The lesson here is one about memory and historical memory. Our community forgot, and our town's history was taken to be in some way especially unique for its supposed lack of Greens. Yet it wasn't simply forgetting, because forgetting is a passive act. No, there had been a deliberately told version of town history, one in which Franklin was supposedly a unique town that had none of the hallmarks of 18th and 19th century life. Franklin was viewed almost like an unchanging mass, when nothing really happened or changed over the course of hundreds of years. In this telling, the town was siloed off from greater events in American and world history. History is not simply a set of facts repeated over and over again. It's an ever-evolving conversation. New questions are asked, new sources are discovered, and new arguments are made. Amidst all of that are historians who are consciously making those arguments through interpretation of evidence. Telling a version of Franklin's history which purposefully excluded town Greens wasn't an accident. It was done with intent. Greens did not fit into preconceived notions of the town's history. A previous town historian said as much when, after quoting the town meeting where it was decided to build the stocks, that he didn't believe that there had been a Green and gave no evidence to support his conclusion. It just simply did not compute. That narrative of Franklin's past is problematic. Franklin has changed greatly over the centuries, and our community never stood alone against the tides of time. We should ask ourselves then, if we could forget these important physical places, what else in Franklin's history has been forgotten? What people, events, places, and changes have occurred that, until more recently, were forgotten or neglected? Unfortunately, that list is too large. Too many aspects of our town's history have been forgotten. From Franklin's maritime and industrial histories to the histories of race, ethnicity, and gender, much of what we thought we knew about our town's past was, in some cases, just only scratching the surface, and in other cases was either entirely unknown or just flat out wrong. Acknowledging that Franklin had town greens disrupts the old narrative. It acknowledges that Franklin was, in many ways, a typical community of its era. More importantly, it helps us begin to understand the community that existed here in the 18th and 19th centuries, how people interacted with this land and each other. Being typical doesn't take away from what makes Franklin unique either. This town has a special history, but it is special because it has been a part of the society surrounding it, not in spite of that wider world. So here's to the town greens. Gone, not forgotten. Their memory a reminder of how our community has changed. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to keep up with the videos that I'm producing on town history and Connecticut history, please make sure to click the subscribe button and the little bell icon so you don't miss any of my uploads. I will hopefully be uploading much more frequently now that I've done the research for this video, which took me way longer than I had anticipated. A lot more archival trips than I had actually originally thought, but it was still a lot of fun. It was a lot of great stuff. And in particular, I'd actually like to also give a thank you to Sierra Dixon and her team up at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. She runs their special collections up there. She's absolutely wonderful and has been super accommodating and helpful, a wealth of knowledge. Their collections up at CMCH up in Hartford are great. And also, I'd also like to give a big thank you to Jared Linder. Jared was a senior at UConn back in the spring, and he actually interned with the Historical Society this past fall. And he actually helped me do some of the research for this. We took a couple trips up to Hartford for this kind of stuff. So thank you, Jared. Once again, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.